The moment I fell, it wasn't just my body that hit the ground. It felt as if my very soul crashed with me. I had been walking carefully across the living room, trying to carry a tray with 2 cups of tea. My hands shook, but I wanted to prove to myself that I could still do something useful. The tray slipped, the cups shattered, and I stumbled, my knees giving way. The sound of porcelain breaking echoed through the house like an alarm, but what followed was not concern, not help, not kindness. It was laughter. Cold, sharp, merciless laughter. My own family, the people I once sacrificed everything for, sat there watching me on the floor as if my pain was a scene from a comedy show. Their laughter cut through me more than the fall itself. My heart raced, my cheeks burned, and for a moment I thought I would faint from the humiliation. The word pain did not just describe what I felt in my knees, it echoed in my chest, in my head, in my very identity. They laughed at my pain, and in that moment, I was erased. I remember looking up, hoping to see at least one hand reaching for me, one voice saying, "Are you okay?" But none came. Instead, whispers filled the air, mocking remarks about how clumsy I had become, how age had turned me into nothing more than a fragile shadow of who I once was. I wanted to scream, to remind them of who I had been, of everything I had done for them. But the laughter drowned out my voice before it even left my lips. Time seemed to slow. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, every beat louder than the last. My chest felt heavy, as if all the years of sacrifice, love, and silent endurance had gathered there in that one instant, demanding to be acknowledged. My face burned with shame, not just because of the fall, but because of the cruel realization that my pain had become entertainment to those who should have protected me. It was as if they were telling me, without words, that I no longer mattered. I tried to pull myself up, my hands trembling against the cold floor, but the weight of humiliation was heavier than my body. My legs felt weak, not only from age, but from the crushing blow of being treated as invisible. They saw me fall, but none of them saw me as a person anymore. Their eyes, filled with mockery, stripped me of my dignity in a way no accident ever could. The word pain echoed again in my mind, not as something physical, but as a sentence, a verdict that my place in the family had been reduced to ridicule. My chest tightened as if the air itself conspired to suffocate me, reminding me of how far I had fallen, not from balance, but from grace. Once, I had been the one everyone leaned on. Once, I had been respected. Now, I was nothing but a punchline in their cruel theater. And yet, deep within that humiliation, something stirred. A flicker, a question. Could it be that my story was not ending here? Could it be that this pain, though sharp and humiliating, was not the final definition of who I was? At that moment, as their laughter echoed, I realized that sometimes pain itself holds the seed of transformation, because when others laugh at your weakness, life gives you a chance to rise stronger than they ever imagined. If this story already touched you from the beginning, leave a like so more people can hear it. Have you ever been laughed at in your weakest moment? My name is Ruth. I'm 76 years old, and once I was the one who everyone respected in this family. My voice carried weight, my advice was sought after, and my sacrifices were recognized, or at least I thought they were. I was the mother who never turned away when someone needed help, the woman who woke up before the sun and only went to bed after everyone else was already safe and cared for. I was the one who worked with tired hands and a hopeful heart, who cooked meals from nothing and still made them taste like love, who mended not only torn clothes but broken spirits. For decades, I was the foundation on which this family stood, the quiet force that held everything together. People used to look at me with admiration, and even if life was hard, I felt my place was secure because I had earned it with sweat, with sleepless nights, with unconditional love. But time is a strange thing. It shifts slowly, almost without you noticing, and one day you wake up and realize you're no longer the pillar you once were. You become the shadow of a memory, and the very people who once leaned on you now look at you as though you are a burden. That is what happened to me. I look back and see the strong woman who carried children on her hips while carrying bags of groceries in both hands, the woman who stood beside her husband when there was nothing in the bank and still managed to keep hope alive at the dinner table. And then I look at who I am now in their eyes, a frail old woman, trembling when she walks, dropping a cup here, forgetting a detail there, and suddenly my past doesn't seem to matter to them. It is a cruel transformation, going from being the respected matriarch to being the subject of quiet whispers and mocking glances. My fragility became their entertainment. My mistakes became their punchlines. Once they praised me for my strength. Now they laugh at me for my weakness. And that is the deepest betrayal of all. Not strangers dismissing you, but your own blood, your own family turning your humanity into a joke. I sometimes sit in silence and remember the days when the house echoed with warmth and gratitude. I remember birthdays where I cooked for everyone, setting the table with care, making sure no one left hungry. I remember the winters when I sewed extra blankets so my children would not feel the cold, even when I myself shivered through the night. I remember the endless hours of work in a small factory, where my hands cracked and bled from the machines. But I never complained because I believed my sacrifices had meaning. I believed they were building a future where I would be honored. But the contrast is brutal. Now, when I drop something on the floor, I hear laughter instead of footsteps rushing to help. When I forget a word, I hear sarcasm instead of patience. When I falter, instead of a hand steadying me, I see eyes rolling. This is the reality of my present. My fragility is no longer met with compassion, but with disdain. The very family that once leaned on me now acts as though I am useless, as though I am nothing but an inconvenience taking up space in their lives. It is not the aging that hurts me, it is the erasure, the feeling that my story, my struggles, my sacrifices no longer carry value. I ask myself sometimes, how can a life full of strength, resilience, and devotion be reduced to a joke? How can children who grew up under my roof, eating food cooked with my tired hands, wearing clothes patched by my needle, forget so easily the woman who made all of that possible? The answer is not easy, and perhaps there is no single answer. But I know this. Being laughed at by the very people who should respect you is a wound deeper than any fall, deeper than any broken bone. It cuts into the essence of who you are, because laughter, when it comes at the cost of someone's dignity, becomes a weapon sharper than a knife. I know there are people out there who might be listening to this and nodding, because they too have felt what I feel, the cruel transition from being valued to being dismissed. And I want you to know, if you've been through it, that your worth has not disappeared. It still lives in the memories you carry, in the lives you touched, in the quiet moments where your strength made a difference, even if no one thanked you for it. And yet, even knowing this, the pain of the present lingers. The laughter still echoes. The weight of their indifference still presses down. But deep within me, there is still a spark, a voice that refuses to be silenced. Because I may be old, I may be frail, but I am not invisible. My story still matters. My life still has value, and no amount of cruel laughter can erase the truth of who I am. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Have you ever felt the sting of being mocked by those who should have protected you? It started with little things, or at least that's how they tried to make it seem. A forgotten word during a conversation, a cup slipping from my hands, the slow way I walked from one room to another. Small human flaws that once upon a time my family would have rushed to soothe or cover with kindness. But now each one of these moments became ammunition, fuel for their whispers, their laughter, their sarcastic remarks. She's not what she used to be. I heard one of them say one afternoon, as though age had stolen everything from me and left only a shell. Another time, as I bent carefully to pick up something I dropped, I caught a muttered voice behind me. "She's more trouble than help these days." The words sliced deeper than they could ever imagine. It didn't stop there. They turned my humanity into entertainment. A stumble when I walked down the hallway became a joke retold at dinner. A pause when I tried to remember. A name became a laugh shared between them. My silence, my restraint, became mistaken for weakness. And worst of all, my grandchildren, those I once held in my arms, those I rocked to sleep, those I sacrificed for, sat and watched. They said nothing. Their eyes looked away. Or worse, they smirked, as though I truly had become irrelevant. The silence of those who could have defended me felt like a betrayal louder than any cruel word. Inside these walls that I once filled with warmth, I began to feel like a stranger. Their conversations carried on around me as though I wasn't even in the room. When I tried to add something, my voice was cut short with a dismissive, "You wouldn't understand." Imagine living decades, raising a family, surviving hardships, carrying scars, and then being told, openly, that your wisdom has expired, that your existence is now a burden. That is the reality I was forced to swallow. What hurts the most is that these were not strangers on the street, not colleagues at a workplace who didn't know me. These were my own children, the very people I once lifted out of despair with nothing but determination and love. I remembered all those nights I went to bed hungry so they wouldn't. I remembered scraping coins together to buy them shoes, hiding my own tears when I couldn't afford something they wanted. And now those same people, the ones who should have cherished the foundation I laid for them, looked at me as though I were an old piece of furniture taking up too much space. Every little slip of mine became a spectacle. If I misplaced my glasses, they laughed. If I repeated a story, they mocked. If I moved slowly, they sighed loudly as if my pace was an insult to their time. I tried to convince myself not to care, to remind myself that I knew who I was, that my worth didn't vanish with age. But the truth is, the isolation dug into me deeper every day. It's not just the words, it's the coldness. It's the way they spoke about me as if I wasn't in the room. "She doesn't serve much purpose anymore," I overheard once, words not even whispered, but spoken openly, as though I were invisible. And invisibility, that's the sharpest cut of all. To live in a home you once built, with people you once raised and feel like a ghost inside, your own story. It is a slow erasure, a quiet removal of dignity that eats at you from within. I would sit in my chair listening to their laughter and wonder when I had stopped being part of their lives and started being the joke they told. My heart pounded with rage and sorrow, but my lips stayed sealed. Because how do you fight when the battlefield is your own home and the enemy wears the faces of those you love? There were times I wanted to scream, to remind them of everything I had given, everything I had endured. To remind them that without me their lives would not look the way they do today. But when I opened my mouth, all I saw were their impatient stares, waiting for me to stumble, waiting for me to falter again so they could laugh. So I stayed quiet, holding my pride close to my chest, even as they stripped it away piece by piece. Loneliness is not just being alone, it is being surrounded by people and still feeling unseen. That was my prison. And their silence when I needed, their defense made the walls close in tighter. I knew I was losing more than respect. I was losing my place in the very family I had built. Do you think silence can sometimes hurt more than cruel words? There are moments in life that carve themselves into your memory with a sharpness so cruel that even years later you can still feel the sting as if it happened yesterday. For me, that moment was not in the silence of a room or whispered behind closed doors, but in the open daylight in front of faces I once trusted. It was the day my own child, the one I carried inside me, the one I sacrificed everything for, looked at me with cold eyes and threw words that cut deeper than any knife. "She's useless now. Just an old woman who causes more trouble than she's worth." The words did not stay floating between us. They fell heavy in the room, echoing against the walls, bouncing into every ear present. And then, the worst part, the laughter. My daughter-in-law let out a sharp, cruel chuckle, as though my pain was her entertainment. Even one of the neighbors, who happened to be there, smiled awkwardly, not daring to defend me, but not looking away either. The room felt smaller, my chest tightened, my pulse raced. I wanted to vanish, to sink into the floor, because in that moment I was not just insulted, I was erased. It is one thing to be mocked in private, but humiliation becomes a beast of another kind when it is done in public. In that instant, I wasn't a mother. I wasn't a woman who had built this family from her bare hands. I was a spectacle, a source of amusement, as if my life, my dignity, my history could be reduced to a cruel punchline. I could feel the blood rush to my face, the burns spreading across my cheeks. My legs trembled as though they no longer remembered how to carry me. My throat tightened, and yet no sound escaped. Not a single word. They had stolen my ability to defend myself. Every pair of eyes around me seemed to watch, not with pity, but with curiosity, like witnesses to a scene they would later gossip about. My hands, wrinkled but once strong, clutched the edge of the chair until my knuckles turned white. I wanted to shout, to remind them of the nights I stayed awake nursing their fevers, the sacrifices I made when money was scarce, the years I gave without asking anything in return. But the weight of humiliation pinned me to silence. I was not seen as a woman of value, but as a burden. I could hear the words repeated in my head like a broken record. Useless. Old. Trouble. It was not just the sound of my child's voice, but the confirmation that they no longer saw me as someone who mattered. That was the real wound. When your own blood can dismiss you so easily, what is left of the years you invested? The laughter was crueler than the insult itself, because laughter is not just noise, it is agreement, it is acceptance, it is a dagger twisted deeper. It meant that others didn't just hear those words, they found them fitting, even amusing. They didn't rise to defend me, they didn't soften the blow, they added to it. I was standing in the center of a storm, stripped of dignity, with no umbrella to shield me. Afterward, conversations continued as though nothing had happened, as though my shame was just a minor interruption. That is the cruelest part, when others move on so easily while you remain paralyzed, bleeding inside. The world keeps spinning, but your heart is left in ruins. I sat there, smiling faintly, pretending. The words hadn't crushed me, because even in humiliation, pride forced me to hold my head up. Yet inside I was crumbling. It is a strange kind of pain when you feel erased in front of those who should protect you. And it is not only about the insult, it is about the audience, about being made small, invisible, while the world watches. That day I realized that humiliation is not just an attack on your ego. It is an assault on your very existence. They were not simply mocking my age, they were mocking my life, my worth, my history. I remember walking away slowly, each step heavy, as if dragging chains behind me. The air outside felt different, thicker, harder to breathe. I looked at the sky, searching for relief, but even the sun felt distant, indifferent. I wondered if I had become exactly what they said. A shadow, fading, irrelevant. But deep down, beneath the shame, a flicker of something else began to stir. The kind of flicker humiliation often awakens, the stubborn fire that whispers, "I am more than what they say." Because humiliation has two faces, one that crushes you and one that ignites you, and in that moment of being stripped down to nothing, something inside me resisted. I couldn't speak then, not yet. But I knew I wasn't done. If you believe no one deserves to be humiliated inside their own family, subscribe now for more stories like this. And tell me, have you ever been pushed so low that laughter at your pain made you question your worth, but also made you want to rise stronger? After humiliation, silence can feel heavier than words. The days that followed that cruel moment left me hollow, carrying a weight that pressed deeper with every glance, every whisper, every step I took in my own home. I thought perhaps the entire world had agreed that I no longer mattered, that maybe, after all, I had been reduced to nothing more than a burden, an extra mouth, a faded memory in the lives of those I had once nurtured. And yet, when the world convinces you that you're invisible, it only takes one soul to prove otherwise. It wasn't a grand speech or a public act of defiance. It began quietly, in the smallest of ways. My grandson, only 16, still walking the line between boy and man, looked at me differently. While others' eyes carried irritation, impatience, or outright dismissal, his gaze lingered with something rare: compassion. He noticed what others ignored, what others had trained themselves to laugh at or brush aside. When I sat, quietly, pretending not to hear the cruel remarks, his eyes softened. When my hands trembled while holding a teacup, he pretended not to see the spill, but later came back with a cloth, helping me discreetly so no one else would mock. It was in those quiet acts that dignity began to flicker again inside me. One evening, after another day of biting words and cutting laughter, I found a small plate of food placed on the nightstand in my room. It wasn't much, just a sandwich and an apple, but it was prepared carefully, with the crusts cut the way I used to do for him when he was small. No one else would have thought of such a thing. And when I looked at him, standing shyly at the door, he only shrugged and said, "I thought you might be hungry." That was when I realized I wasn't as invisible as they wanted me to believe. The world teaches us that big victories are loud, but sometimes survival is nurtured in whispers. He began to sit with me in the evenings, asking questions about my past, not out of obligation, but genuine curiosity. "Grandma, what was it like when you were my age? How did you and Grandpa meet?" He listened with an attentiveness that made me feel alive again, reminding me that I was more than the frail body struggling in the present. I was a woman with stories, wisdom, and strength that had carried generations. In his company, I was no longer useless. I was a living archive, a guide, someone who mattered. And then came the gestures that no one else saw. A hand slipped into mine when the sting of an insult had left me trembling. A quiet glance at the dinner table when others ignored me, telling me without words, "I see you." Once, when the laughter grew loud again at my expense, I felt a soft kick under the table, his way of signaling, "Ignore them, I'm here." It was enough to remind me I was not entirely alone. There's a certain magic in being seen by just one person when everyone else turns away. That recognition is like water to a dying plant. Each gesture, each act of quiet defiance against the cruelty of others brought me back piece by piece. My dignity, once stripped and discarded, began to stitch itself together. The mocking laughter of my family still hurt, yes, but now it had a counterpoint: the silent loyalty of a boy who refused to let me fade. He didn't confront them yet. That moment hadn't come. But his presence itself was a rebellion. At an age when most teenagers are consumed by their own world, he risked being mocked himself by choosing to stand quietly beside me. It gave me strength I didn't think I had left. For the first time in a long time, I slept without tears on my pillow, because I knew that at least one heart in that house still beat for me. What others failed to see, he chose to honor. And in that choice, my grandson became the quiet flame that rekindled mine. Dignity is not always roared into existence. Sometimes it is whispered back, through acts of care so small they almost go unnoticed, except by the heart that desperately needs them. The pain of being laughed at didn't vanish, but it began to transform. Instead of crushing me into silence, it started to awaken something else. Resolve. If one person believed I was worth defending, perhaps I could believe it too. Perhaps the time would come when silence would be broken, not just for me, but because he had reminded me that my story was not yet finished. Because when someone holds your hand in your weakest moment, it does more than comfort, it resurrects. Have you ever been defended by someone when you least expected it, and in that defense felt your dignity return piece by piece? It happened in a way I never imagined. For so long I had grown used to the sound of my own silence, to the sharpness of cruel words and the sting of mocking laughter that followed every stumble, every mistake, every frailty of my aging body. I thought that silence would remain unbroken, that my voice would remain buried beneath the weight of indifference and ridicule. But that day, everything shifted. That day, the boy who had once depended on me for everything decided to stand between me and those who treated me like nothing. We were sitting at the table when the familiar pattern repeated itself. I reached for a glass, my hands trembling just enough for the water to spill slightly onto the tablecloth. It was nothing extraordinary, just the sort of clumsiness age sometimes brings. But instead of compassion, the sound that followed was laughter. My daughter-in-law's smirk, my son's dismissive glance, even the younger ones echoing in cruel amusement, it all blended into a chorus of mockery. I froze, as I always did, shrinking inside myself, wishing only for the ground to swallow me. But this time, before I could lower my head, a voice cut through the room. "Stop." It was my grandson. His tone was sharp, filled with the conviction I hadn't heard from anyone in this house for years. The laughter halted, as though someone had slammed a door on it. He stood, his young frame trembling not with fear but with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. His eyes, usually soft when they looked at me, now blazed with defiance as he turned toward the very people who raised him. "Stop laughing at her pain," he said again, louder this time. "She's the reason we are all here. Without her, none of you would have what you have today." The silence that followed was unlike any silence I had felt before. Not the cold, suffocating silence of dismissal, but the stunned, heavy silence of people forced to confront something they never thought would be spoken aloud. My breath caught in my chest. My heart, so used to beating with shame, now pounded with something else. Recognition. He didn't stop there. His hands trembled as he reached into his backpack, pulling out something I hadn't seen in years. Old photographs, documents, scraps of the past I had kept tucked away in boxes. He laid them on the table one by one. A photo of me at the factory. Sweat, dripping down my face as I worked double shifts to pay for the roof over their heads. A letter from my late husband, praising the sacrifices I had made when times were hardest. Receipts from debts I had paid when they had none. Pictures of birthdays I had organized, meals I had cooked, nights I had stayed awake, tending to their illnesses. Evidence of a life given, piece by piece, to the very people who now laughed at me. "Look at her," he said, pointing to the images. "You call her weak, but she carried this family. You mock her, but she built everything you are standing on. You wouldn't even exist without her sacrifices. And you dare laugh?" The words struck harder than any slap. I watched as faces shifted, some with shame, others with denial. My son tried to intervene, muttering that it wasn't that serious. But my grandson wouldn't allow the moment to dissolve. "It is serious," he snapped back. "You've turned the woman who gave you everything into a joke. You've silenced her, ridiculed her, erased her value in front of her own grandchildren. Well, I won't stay silent. Not anymore. She matters. She matters more than any of us." For the first time in so many years, my voice didn't need to fight its way out of me. It was carried, loud and fierce, through his. The echo of his words reverberated in my chest, filling spaces I thought had long been emptied. I could feel the sting of tears on my cheeks, but they weren't born of humiliation this time. They were born of vindication. My grandson, the boy I thought had been too young to understand, had seen it all. And he had chosen to speak when everyone else chose silence. In that moment, I realized that the cruelest erasure had not been my family's words. It had been their decision to pretend I was invisible. But invisibility ended the second my grandson stood. His defiance turned the room into a courtroom, with him as the unexpected judge, and the evidence of my life as the testimony no one could deny. The air was heavy, thick with truths no one wanted to acknowledge but could no longer escape. My grandson's voice became my voice, strong, unyielding, breaking the chains of mockery and neglect. For the first time in a long time, I felt the weight lift from my chest. For the first time, I wasn't shrinking into silence, and in that stillness after his words, I knew nothing would ever be the same. If this moment of justice made your heart beat faster, click like so this story can reach even more people. But tell me, if you were in my place, would you have expected such courage to come from the youngest voice in the room? When the room finally grew quiet, and my grandson's words lingered in the air like a storm that refused to fade, I felt something I had not felt in years, a deep and unshakable sense of being seen. For so long, my life had been measured only by what I could no longer do, by the frailties that came with age, by the mistakes magnified into entertainment for those who should have protected me. But in that moment, the laughter was silenced. The cruelty stopped in its tracks, and I realized that dignity, once thought stolen, could be restored in the most unexpected way. In the days that followed, the atmosphere inside my home shifted. My son and his wife tried to act as though nothing had happened, their voices hushed when I walked into the room, their eyes avoiding mine. Perhaps they thought ignoring the confrontation would erase it, but they were wrong. The truth, once spoken, cannot be unsaid. My grandson's defiance had carved a line in the sand, and everyone in that house now knew where they stood, either on the side of silence and cruelty, or on the side of respect and justice. I no longer looked at myself as someone erased. Each step I took through the house felt steadier, not because my body had grown stronger, but because my spirit had. My grandson's courage had given me back a piece of myself that I thought was gone forever. That realization carried me to a decision I made in silence, a decision I never announced, but one that would define the legacy of my life. I began to write. In a simple notebook, I put down names, memories, and choices. I thought of every sacrifice I had made. The nights I stayed awake, mending clothes, so my children would not go to school ashamed. The meals I skipped so they would never go hungry. The countless moments when I bit my tongue, choosing peace over confrontation, all for their sake. I thought of how, despite it all, they had chosen to mock me, to laugh at my pain, to turn my existence into a stage for their amusement. And then I thought of him, the boy who chose not to laugh, who chose not to stay silent, who stood up when no one else dared. My grandson, with his trembling hands and fiery words, had shown me more loyalty in one evening than others had shown me in decades. That was when my decision became clear. What remained of my inheritance, my house, my savings, my possessions, the memories I had, carefully preserved, would no longer be divided by obligation. I would no longer leave behind pieces of myself to those who treated me as nothing. Instead, everything of value, both material and emotional, would go to the one who saw my worth when others erased it. My grandson would inherit not just my belongings, but my trust, my gratitude, and the continuation of my story. It was not revenge, it was justice. This decision gave me peace, unlike any I had known in years. It was as though I had finally taken back control over a life that had been slipping through my fingers. I no longer needed apologies, no longer needed validation from those who had laughed. Their laughter had been their truth, just as my dignity would now be mine. Some might say forgiveness is the higher path, and perhaps they are right. But forgiveness does not mean forgetting. Forgiveness does not mean leaving everything behind to those who used cruelty as their language. My choice was not about punishing, but about honoring the truth of who stood by me when it mattered most. There are nights I sit by my window, staring into the dark sky, and I feel lighter. Not because my pain never happened, it did, and it scarred me deeply, but because that pain no longer defines me. What defines me now is the fact that, in my darkest moment, someone proved I still mattered. That realization gave me the strength to look forward rather than back. I wonder often how others in my place would act. Would they choose to forgive the ones who laughed, giving them yet another chance to show kindness? Or would they, like me, decide that love, legacy, and trust belong only to those who truly earn it? And you, in my place, would you forgive those who laughed at your pain? Or would you give everything to the one who stood by your side? If stories like this make you reflect on family and justice, subscribe now so you won't miss the next one. They laughed at my pain, but one moment changed everything. There are moments in life when we believe the darkness has already consumed everything inside us, when every echo of laughter at our pain seems to push us deeper into silence, making us feel invisible even within our own homes. And yet, it is exactly in those moments of despair that faith teaches us something greater. That dignity can be restored. That even one voice standing in truth can silence 1,000 in cruelty. What happened to me was not just a personal wound. It was a revelation. I learned that God sometimes allows us to pass through valleys of humiliation so that we may discover the strength to rise again, and so that we may recognize who truly walks beside us. I spent years believing that aging meant fading away, that every weakness, every slip of memory, every physical limit would reduce me to a shadow of the person I once was. My family's laughter seemed to confirm those fears, each cruel smile or mocking word striking me like a blow. But then, out of that same family, came a single act of courage that changed everything. My grandson's voice, trembling yet firm, cut through the silence that had imprisoned me. His courage reminded me that no one is ever too old, too weak, or too forgotten to matter. Faith carried me through those nights when tears blurred my vision and the weight of loneliness pressed against my chest. I prayed, not for revenge, but for peace, not for others to fall, but for my dignity to rise. And slowly, through the loyalty of one soul, I felt God's answer. He does not always send armies to defend us. Sometimes he sends one person, one child, one friend, one grandson, whose actions reveal the truth more powerfully than any words we could speak. The lesson I want you to take with you is this: your value is not defined by the cruelty of others. It is not measured by what you can no longer do, but by the life you have already lived, by the sacrifices you made, by the love you gave even when it was not returned. No laugh at your pain can erase the legacy of your strength. No cruel word can diminish the worth of your soul. I choose to believe that every scar is a testimony, every tear is a seed, and every humiliation is an opportunity for redemption. For me, redemption came not through apologies that never arrived, but through the simple truth that someone chose to see me when others turned away. That truth is enough to heal, enough to inspire, enough to remind me that even in the last chapters of life, there is room for justice and grace. To those who mocked me, I no longer carry hatred. I release them into the hands of God, because His justice is greater than mine. But to the one who defended me, I give my gratitude, my love, and the knowledge that He helped restore what was broken in me. This is how I reclaim my peace. And to you who listen now, perhaps carrying your own silent wounds, let me remind you, you are not forgotten. Your pain is not invisible. There is always someone who sees, and even if people fail, God never looks away. Hold on to that truth, because it will sustain you when everything else feels lost. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think about the power of truth, courage, and faith, then click like now and subscribe so you can continue walking with me through stories that reveal the strength hidden in ordinary lives. And don't go far. The next video will show a moment even more powerful, where betrayal meets truth in a way that no one expected. You won't want to miss it.